So thank you everybody for having us here. Marianne and I are so excited. This is my co-author, Marianne Odom. She is so happy to be here, she woke up speechless. She is just totally speechless today, and you'll have to bear with me. We are a duo in everything we do. We play off of each other, we gig each other. Today it's the Gaylon show. So I may have to depend on my notes even more than usual, so you'll understand that, I hope. So this is where I would say, first slide. So we have our husbands here. I have to say, this is my husband. He's a technology guy. He's going to change the slides. Marianne's husband is in the back, John. He is our photographer. And so we come fully prepared. And I'd like to say that the Van Zant DRT chapter is here. They told me last week that they were coming. And it is very nice to see you all, particularly my DRT friends. So here we go. This is where I say I'm Gaylon. And I'm from Hull. That's a little town in southeast Texas. And Marianne would say, "Hi, I'm Marianne. And I'm from Tyler. And I now live in San Antonio." Okay, so it's very nice to meet all you ladies from the TCU Center for Texas Studies. We kind of put our nose in the air and said, we are academic. We normally dress up more cowgirl than this. We thought today we should look a little church lady-like, but have our boots and hats. And last night we went out to dinner and everybody in Fort Worth was dressed in hats and boots. And so I'm sure y'all don't even see that we're any different. And thank you too for being here, the Zoomers. Makes it very special that we are so technology involved today. Nobody has to drive anywhere, you can just Zoom. Okay, so we were told by Leanna Schooley that you all, this crowd, would like to know a little something about oral histories and why you do it and how you do it and that sort of thing. So this speech will include some of that. Our emphasis in our book, Growing Up in the Lone Star State, has to do with childhoods exclusively. But beginning researchers, which you all may be, may not think childhood as important as other accomplishments later on in somebody's life, but our experience says otherwise. So today, for those who are researching your family history, I'll talk about ways to bring out childhood memories and what to look out for. And then we'll highlight a few famous Texans with connections to Dallas-Fort Worth. And let me tell you, there are a lot of really cool people. You all, if I'm reading your faces the right age, most of you will know all of the people we're going to talk about today. And we're going to explain how they got from a childhood and some foreshadowings to reach the success they got to. But you might be curious, so first we're going to have a little background on how this book got started. So our book features 50 famous Texans who recall in their own words what their childhoods were like in Texas in the first half of the 20th century. The oldest one was born in 1906, and the youngest one was born in 1954. So it says little amount of time in there. And so that is roughly from the time span of Model Ts till we sent rockets to the moon. Just think of the difference that was. And so as these people look back, they reflect on what it was about those childhoods that gave them the courage to follow their dreams, whatever they were. And those dreams led to successful careers in Hollywood and Broadway and music, politics, business, TV journalism, and more. So collecting those recollections took us 40 years. We are the poster children of persistence. We didn't give up. So, just what was it about growing up in Texas that prepared these people to such heights of success? To put it simply, they were grateful they grew up in Texas. Most believe of Texas's exceptionalism, and that is attributed by them to several things: the sheer size of Texas, the magnificence and diversity of our geography, and the natural resources that offer endless opportunity here in our big state. They are proud of this unique history. Texas was its own country, as you know, the Republic of Texas. You ladies know all about that history. And that inspired in many of these people a very independent personality. They got it from their roots that went back to when we were our own country. So our notables are absolute direct proof that Texas was a good place to make a good start, and we think it still is. And we contend it is the experiences of being raised in Texas that set the stage for what they were to become. So this is very interesting, I think. Even those famous Texans that we have in there who've written their own biographies, they kind of flash through their childhoods. They think their adult accomplishments are more important for whatever reason. But we think what you hear as a kid, what you eat, where you go to church, what vacations you take, what your grandma's like, all of those kinds of things mold you into the person you become. So we think these memoirs should do the opposite. We think they should concentrate more on their childhoods and less on their later life, because it's the childhoods that foreshadowed all of that. So, y'all are supposed to laugh here now. We began this in the early 1980s when we like to say we were young and cute. And look at us now. We also say don't give up on a good idea. You may end up looking like old hags, but you get it done. So when we met, we worked in a tiny, tiny office at the San Antonio Express-News, just a couple of blocks from the Alamo. And it was so tiny that for Marianne to get into her file cabinet, I had to swivel my chair. So we were going to either be friends or foes, and we picked friendship. Marianne tells this part better than I do, but I'll try my best. From your faces, most of you will remember in the 80s, Texas was hot. The movie Urban Cowboy, filmed in Pasadena, took the country by storm. Everybody was dancing, line dancing, and they had on their cowboy boots and hats. It was everywhere. The Broadway musical Best Little Whorehouse was also a big scream. And Dallas was on TV. And I know y'all lived up here, so everybody watched Dallas. And then on the political scene, newly elected President Ronald Reagan was quite the cowboy, although not a Texan. And George H.W. Bush said he was a Texan, and I guess he was. He just wasn't born here. The Express-News sent Marianne and me to the inauguration, which really is a whirlwind of parties. It's a real social event. And we didn't sleep for days, and we worked constantly. And we had the time of our lives because we end up knowing we're workhorses. We have our best fun when we're working hard. And that kind of solidified our friendship, and we knew we could work together. But closer to home, Marianne had written this fabulous story about her father, who was the police chief in Tyler, for Father's Day. And I'd written a tearful thing about my granny for it was new then, Grandparents' Day, for the Express-News. And we got, we wrote hundreds, thousands of stories, I don't know, it was endless. Newspapers are endless. But we got more responses about those two stories than anything we ever wrote. So it was obvious to us, people like down-home, personal, relatable stories. So we took note of the national and international focus on Texas and the universal appeal of down-home stories. And we began to marvel at the number of famous people who claimed Texas roots that were in this big picture of what was going on that day. There were so many Texans in the public eye that the Express News sent Marianne to New York. She was the fashion editor, to do this big Sunday story on front of the magazine about the Texas chic at the Big Apple. And that's about the time we began to wonder, what was about Texans? Was there more to it than that? Or was it just a coincidence that all of these famous people happened to be from Texas? So we started interviewing Texans who were at least nationally known and at the top of their game, whatever their game was. We insisted on sitting down with them face to face, and we recorded their intimate anecdotal stories of their childhoods. And we limited it to native Texans. You couldn't have just said you were. We had to prove that you were a native Texan. We had to have some kind of spec like that, right? So who here is a native-born Texan? You two, I know. Look at that crowd. Who got here as soon as you could? That lady there. Marvin got here when he was 6 weeks old, and he don't count. So those who got here as soon as you could and call yourself a Texan, but you really ain't. That also includes some people who are famous who said they were Texans and they weren't, such as Walter Cronkite, Bill Moyers, Ray Wiley Hubbard, and Charlie Pride. In fact, we turned down an interview with Walter Cronkite. We were at CBS News in New York. I mean, we may be persistent, but we ain't smart. We turned down Walter Cronkite because he didn't meet our specs. So we had no idea, absolutely no idea, this would take us nearly 4 decades. And just by chance, I conducted the first interview and the last one. So the first one, y'all probably know there, folklorist and character actor Geach Cook. Oh, it's Mary Sue Neptune has entered the room.
I didn't follow this. I was supposed to go the other way, but I knew my way around here.
This is our dear friend from Austin who has moved up here lately. She's in my DAR chapter. So we got the DRT and the DAR here today. Mary Sue, you have missed 7 pages.
What?
You have missed 7 pages.
I've missed 7.
Yes, but you will catch up soon.
Okay, just
Start.
start over.
Okay, so we had no idea this was going to take us 40 years. And Geach Cook was our very first interview. He once owned Lukenbach, where Willie Whalen and the boys hung out. Y'all remember the song? Well, he was just exactly what we were looking for. He was tall and handsome, and he wore that hat there sitting on the bar, and he's having him a drink at the bar, and he was the funniest and the nicest guy ever. It was 1981, and we met in the historic Menger Hotel right next to the Alamo, y'all know. Where better to start this very Texas project? The last interview was this other lady, that State Representative Sinfronia Thompson, in 2018. That's a long stretch, y'all. So she is the longest serving black representative in the Texas legislature. And she had a quite different growing up than Geach Cook had. And so Marvin and I met her in her office at the state capitol. So we ultimately went to the ends of the earth, literally, for these interviews. That little cowpoke who's on the cover of the book, right there, that is American Ambassador Samuel Lewis to Israel. He served as the longest ambassador to a foreign country the United States ever had. He was there during the Camp David Accords. So he went from a cowpoke to a diplomat that helped bring peace between Egypt and Israel. See, you never know what you're going to end up. So, this is Marianne's part 2, but I'm going to try my best. As to how we got all these interviews, were y'all wondering that? How did you come up with these people? Well, the keys, I'm blocking the camera. Sorry, Zoomers. The keys were connections and persistence. So listen close to this. Our editor at the Express News wanted us to get her college roommate, who was Liz Carpenter. You know her connection to the Johnsons? Well, so when we got Liz, she wanted us to get to her boss, who was a ladybird. And so we went to the ranch and we rocked in the chairs with Ladybird on the porch, and she told us about growing up. And once you get somebody of Ladybird status, you know, in your project, then people just fall all over themselves wanting to be in there, because she gave us the credibility we needed very early on to get it started. But let me tell you, it wasn't easy. They didn't all fall in our laps. We chased some of the interviewees for years. For instance, Nolan Ryan. Mary Sue, you know this story. We emailed and called Nolan Ryan for a couple of years, and his secretary was very nice, and he never said no, but he didn't say yes. He was very non-committal. And then at one point we said, oh, heck, let's just write him one more time and then write him off. And that time he said yes. And within a couple of weeks, we were in Nolan Ryan's office. And he is a storyteller, y'all. And if y'all are baseball fans, you need a book just to read Nolan's. He learned so many childhood lessons that he told us about. The other was this Sinfronia Thompson that was in that earlier slide. She told us no, and then yes, and then no. And we had all of these connections to her. This is going on for like 2.5 years. And then at one point she said, hell no. And then before you know it, we got a call from her that she said, I'm ready to talk now. And she was the very last interview. And she had a story to tell that she hadn't been wanting to tell until the time was right. And so that's how that persistence pays off. So we were in the features department at the newspaper, and we often knew who was coming to town. So if they met our specs in any way, sometimes we could pounce on them. And that's how we got Geach Cook. And then we sat with sweet Trini Lopez, who's from Dallas, y'all know, in the hotel courtyard before he gave a benefit concert that night. And we actually interviewed Catherine Crosby. See her down there? Catherine Crosby, when she was promoting her book about her life with Bing and had come to the newspaper office itself. And so that little girl there with Catherine Crosby, that's my daughter, Yael, who is 45 years old. And so if you needed any proof about how long it took us, that picture tells it all. Then somebody called us one day and said, hey, did you know Bob Schieffer is over at the TV station next door? And we ran over there, and he graciously took time for us. We know Fort Worth is really proud of Bob Schieffer and his wife, Pat. They were so gracious to us over and over and over. Pat supplied all of these pictures, and he invited his brother Tom and his sister Sharon. Are any of y'all Tom and Sharon Schieffer? He wrote and said, Marianne and Gaylon are going to talk about me today. Y'all need to go to the library in Fort Worth. And so we were really hoping that they would show up. So by 1986, which is short order really, we had 30 interviews done. And we thought we had a book. But after that great start, we have to admit it, y'all, we let life get in our way. You know that middle age of life? You get too busy for things you really want to do. We moved around, we had job changes, we had name changes, we had children. Some of us had more divorces than the others of us, and then some of us had more remarriages than the others of us. So for a little more than 2 decades, this wonderful collection, this beginning of a book, these memoirs and tapes sat in dusty boxes in our attics. We never gave up on it, and every year or so we'd say, we sure are bad girls for not sticking with that, but we ain't got time. It just wasn't a priority at that point in our life. So since y'all are also up here, you know about the Eagles. They were from this area. When they got back together and they did that album, Hell Freezes Over, and they said they never broke up, they just took a 14-year vacation. Well, Marianne and I took a 27-year vacation. So then in 2013, we picked it up again. We dusted off all those old manuscripts and realized it was really pretty good. We let life get in our way because Texas had changed and matured, and there was more about Texas than the people we had gotten early on. We completed 22 chapters in 2 years. And let me tell you, unless you really work in the TV news or something like that and have all the connections, that is fast to get to this level of people. So our process, and y'all are supposed to be interested in the process, that got refined as we went along. When possible, before the interviews, we sent a list of questions so people could think and take notes and remember dates and how to spell Grandpa's name for real. So out of 52 interviews, 47 made the book, but only two were not face-to-face. So that was really fantastic. Most people don't write a book that way, but that's how you sit with people and get their tender stories, is by sitting with them and looking at their eyes, right? That's the Texas way. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So we had to transcribe these tapes. How many have done transcribing? It is a killer. It is a downer. It is a time-consuming thing. But you have to do that, right? Nobody's going to watch a talking head for 2 hours or listen to a tape for 2 hours. Unless maybe it's your grandma and then you cry and you put it away and you never listen to it again. So after each interview, we edited the transcripts. We sent them to the interviewees. They got a chance to correct spellings, to change stories, to do whatever little editing they wanted to do, because one, we wanted it to be right. Two, they might have a different way of talking about Mama once they saw it in writing. Bob Schieffer did. Bob Schieffer told about how his mama hit him one time with a broom because he mouthed off to her. He took that out. But now y'all know that. He probably needed it. Yeah, so anyway, it's their story. So we allowed them to tell it in the way they wanted to. So some people, like the author Sandra Brown, who's read a Sandra Brown book? Yep, all you ladies have. Okay, she rewrote a lot because she's a writer, so you might think so. Red McCombs, who just died, who's the only billionaire who's ever hugged us. Have y'all been hugged by billionaires? No, Red McCombs hugged us. Okay, so he didn't change a word, not one word of his whole transcript. He's quite the storyteller, and he told it good enough the first time. That's the way he wanted it. So we like the oral history method because the people telling their own story in their own words are far better than she and I could ever write a feature story or try to tell it secondhand. It reveals more about who they are and how they talk. So there are people who study about word patterns of speech. They can go back to oral histories and say, they could learn about people by just, the way I'm talking right now. They can learn something about me. Who knows what? But they would learn. It's conversational, and frankly, it's endearing. So the drawback to this oral history stuff, though, is this dreadful transcribing. If you're going to edit it for popular consumption, you have just got to do that. You can rearrange the anecdotes, the periods, the topics, and so on. If you talk about grandma at the beginning, the middle, and the end, you can group them all together, but you can't put however, therefore, or any little sentence that ties it together, because you can't add not one word yourself. This is their own words, and that's all it is. It is frustrating to newspaper people like us, because we're used to writing feature stories, but you simply cannot put words in their mouths. So when you do it for yourselves, which I understand a lot of you probably are, do not put not one comma, not one period, not one adjective, or do not correct their grammar. If they said, I ain't going to go there, well, that's what they said. So don't make them sound like a scholar. That is how they talk. All right. We had the audio, but we always planned in the end to have a printed book, because technology changes all the time. It just changes all the time. But the written word is the written word. So the ultimate to us was the book. So, do y'all know Delbert McClinton? He's a Fort Worth boy. Of course, an option you or other researchers might want to do is you could write a narrative based on what their interviews are, but we just have to say, people telling it in their own words are the strongest you can get. And boy, this Delbert McClinton right here, he is one storyteller, and he told all about living in Fort Worth, which we'll tell you more about in a little bit. Another big frustration is you have an editor when you do a real book and get it published. Every word that Mariana and I had gathered from these people became gold to us, and we could quote every story. They become our friends. The stories are our friends. The people are our friends. But when we got to our editor, she cut 54% of our manuscript. That is more than half. And those were sacred words to us, and we pushed back as much as we could. But heck, they were publishing the thing, and they had a say, and once you sign a contract, that's the way it is. Okay. The most disappointing for us, and I wish Marianne could tell this. This is Marianne's story. The most disappointing loss we had was Aaron Spelling's chapter. You see that there? That's Aaron Spelling's handwriting. He rewrote the final paragraph of his chapter. Marianne interviewed him in Los Angeles at the Aaron Spelling Productions office in 1983. He was enthusiastic. He thought this was the greatest story idea he ever had. And this man is a storyteller. He knew a story or a book idea or a script idea when he saw one. He told all about growing up Jewish and poor on the wrong side of the tracks in Dallas. He later approved his chapter with some minor editing, and he signed that contract right there. But being a business mogul, he had Marianne sign a document that said, we didn't know it was going to take 40 years. But Marianne had signed a document that said before it goes to press, he would be allowed to read and see how his chapter looked. Then he died, and then we took 40 years. And so we wanted that chapter in the book. We had everything to prove it. We had to get approval from Mrs. Candy Spelling. Mrs. Candy Spelling said no. That what they already had in the memoir that he had written was good enough for them, and they didn't want anything about Aaron in any other book. Jacqueline Smith called Candy Spelling and said, I'm in the book. We got to have Aaron in there. And another one of our chapter people, and she still said no. And when we asked our publisher, the Briscoe Center for American History, hey, can we just sneak it in there and just ask forgiveness later? Directly, our publisher said, we are not having Mrs. Aaron Spelling sue the Briscoe Center for American History. And that was the end of that, and we lost the chapter. And we've never been able to tell that story before, but since we're in Fort Worth and he's a Dallas boy, we get to tell it. If we had finished the book in the 1980s, as our original plan was, we would have had Aaron Spelling, who, when you think about the top 5 best chapters, his was 1 or 2. Wouldn't you say, Marianne? Yeah. Okay, so word to the wise, do not take 40 years to do your project. You don't know who's going to die, and it might be you. Okay, so everybody also wants to ask, how long should an interview be? So our shortest one was this rodeo clown here, the #1 rodeo clown in America, Leon Coffey. We had 30 minutes with Leon Coffey in the bowels of the San Antonio, what's it called, Rodeo Center, wherever it is, before he had a matinee. He told us more in half an hour than we got out of some people who talk for 2 hours. It just depends. And then our longest was with Jerry Levias. He broke the color barrier in football in the Southwest Conference when SMU signed him up as the first black scholarship athlete. I'm sure y'all probably remember those years. We laughed with him, and we held back tears with him. We sat around his dining room table in Houston 4.5 hours. We had sent Jerry Levias our interview questions because he wasn't going to do this if we asked the same old questions every other interview had been in his life. And he said, I'll do this because nobody's ever asked me that stuff about my childhood before. And by golly, he was going to answer everyone. And he did. And because of that, we have enough for a documentary. If there's any documentary in Terry in here, we have your subject. So whether we interview these people in the 1980s or the 20-teens, every single person in our book was eager to talk about Texas, like Aaron Spelling. Even those who had written their own autobiographies had basically glossed over their early years. And their childhood wasn't the usual topic they discussed in interviews. People just didn't ask them. They would say, what's about your next movie, your next TV show, your next whatever. They didn't say, what did your grandma cook? So anyway, we got all that stuff that showed the trajectory of their lives. So here, former mayor and HUD secretary Henry Cisneros. Do y'all remember Henry? Okay. These are foreshadowings of what people become. We were interviewing him and said, what did you play with when you were a kid? And he jumped up from the table and ran in the other room and came back with these little metal cars. And he said he would sit in the driveway and draw out streets and intersections and where the cars parked and where the houses would go and whatever. He was drawing infrastructure as a kid, and he ended up being the HUD secretary. You know, urban planning. That's what he was doing as a kid. And so we interviewed Henry around his dining room table in what had been his grandparents' house on the west side of San Antonio. All the big family gathered there every Sunday. They went to church and then they ate at grandmother's house. And he and his wife have lived there for decades. He's never moving away from there. So many of our interviews got emotional. Jacqueline Smith, y'all know Jacqueline Smith, Charlie's Angels? She is so tender, she cried through most of the interview. We sat, now y'all have to get jealous, we sat in her living room in her home on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood. Charlie's Angels also had Farrah Fawcett. So 2 of the 3 were native Texans. It's too bad we didn't get Farrah. And that was, of course, Aaron Spelling's productions. And that's what Jacqueline Smith called Mrs. Candy. And Mrs. Candy said no to Jacqueline Smith. I don't know how. Anyway, she cried. And her PR agent was there who took this picture, and he wrote a little story and put it on whatever these online things are. It went viral. This is our very first international coverage of our book. It was tweeted everywhere that Jacqueline Smith had cried doing an interview with her dear friends from Texas. Unnamed, didn't name the book, but we were her dear friends from Texas, and she cried. And it went to all those places around the world, starting with the Daily Mail online in London. Now, that kind of encouragement can keep you going. We weren't really looking for sound bites, but we did get a lot of what we call money quotes. That's a clever way of describing in a sentence or two something that capsulizes a key factor in their development. And it's a foreshadowing. Also, something as simple as, "What kind of kid were you?" jumps to the heart of what the childhood was like. Here, A.J. Foyt gets his first race car. His daddy built that for him when he was 4 or 5 years old. Some of the other surefire questions to bring up memories are about mama and daddy, and toys and food and teachers and church and sports and music, and always grandparents. Some of you are probably grandparents. I can't tell you how influential you are with your grandchildren, and you may not know it. You may not know it. The most important advice we can give any of you who are going to conduct any of these type of interviews is to be a good listener. You are there to learn from whoever it is you're sitting across from. You know what you think. Keep it to yourself, because you're there asking them what they think and what they remember. And do not use leading questions. "Don't you remember the time, blah, blah, blah?" Just say, "Tell me the time you went fishing in the creek." And then they bring up their own question. You just recast this question. Okay, so here is Rex Tillerson, who was the head of ExxonMobil and Secretary of State. And he talks about being an Eagle Scout. And we interviewed him in Bartonville, not too far from here, at his wife's horse farm. So we're going to share some aha moments, some money quotes, and foreshadowing that capture the essence of what we were after. The childhood experiences. Oh, by the way, we think, regardless of your politics, Rex Tillerson is a straight arrow. And he got to be a straight arrow by being an Eagle Scout. He said he made all of his decisions in life with a Boy Scout creed. He always says that, and the 10 Commandments.
No,
Golden Rule in his head. And we wouldn't have known that, and nobody else has ever asked him about that, but we have that in the book. So, Marianne tells this part. Marianne interviewed Liz Smith while she was getting her hair done. I think her head was in the washing bowl part of the time she was interviewing her, before a stage show that a bunch of famous Texans transplanted into New York were doing to raise money for a New York theater. She was known for being a gossip columnist that celebrities actually liked because she was fair and kind in her columns. She didn't have to be scathing. And she was friends with many of them. Liz was born in Fort Worth in 1923. Do you know she was that old? She was old. Her mother wanted Liz to be a little debutante and wear little white gloves. She preferred playing with her older brothers, and Tom Mix was her hero. Her fondest childhood memory was learning to read. She said she used to sit on the floor with a book and look at those things on the page and said, "One day I will figure it out." And she went by herself on a bus to this Fort Worth Public Library when she learned, to her amazement, you could get books out of there for free. It changed her life. So this is a quote from Liz Smith. "As soon as I found out you could get free books out of the library, I was the happiest person ever. I didn't really grow up in a house where there were many books. My mother bought books, but only if they matched the furniture or something." So this voracious reader turned into a vivid writer. An interview with actor Zachary Scott at the University of Texas, when she was a student there, led to a job interview for Modern Screen magazine in New York, and they hired her on the spot. That was the foreshadowing there. So, although Liz Smith did not grow up to be the socialite her mama wanted her to be, she did the next best thing. She wrote about them all. And the result was this globe-trotting career that most of us could only dream of. So Rex Reed, did y'all know he was from up here? Nope. And a few days before this gathering, the same gathering of Texans in New York City, Marianne called Rex Reed to confirm the interview. And he said, I can't do it then, but you got me on the phone now. So Marianne got her notebook and she wrote down what he was saying. So that's one of the very few that we didn't do in person or on tape. Rex was born in 1938 in Fort Worth. Did you know that? Who knew that? Not a person here knew that, Marianne. We have already taught y'all something. The family moved to Louisiana when he was a little boy. He was 6. His father was gone a lot, and he had a job in the oil company, was out on a rig in the Gulf. So his young, beautiful mother took him to movies, and the two of them spent so much time together, he told Marianne he almost thought of her as his girlfriend. And he dealt with that later in therapy. The only real grounding Rex Reed said he had came from spending every summer and the holidays on his grandmother's farm in West Texas. His grandmother, who he called Ma Reed, looked like Mammy Yoakum. She wore a bonnet and an apron. She smoked a corncob pipe. And she used the outhouse even after getting indoor plumbing. At the farm, Rex did all the chores and he hated it. He just wanted to get to Hollywood. But after a long career in the make-believe world of movies, he told Marianne he sees his experiences on Ma Reed's farm as reality. Life on the farm had the truth of Westerns, he said. And today, he spends his time at this 300-year-old farmhouse in Connecticut. There, he remembers his childhood through quilts, made from the shirts of his boyhood dresses. Not his boyhood dresses, his mother's dresses from his boyhood. Just like the farm life in the Westerns, quilts speak the truth of his childhood. And maybe that explains his scathing reviews for films that don't ring true. So author Sandra Brown was born in 1948 in Waco, but she grew up in Fort Worth. Who knew that? Nobody here knew that. We are teaching these people stuff, Marianne. Her daddy was an editorial writer for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and her mother was what she called the fanciful one. Both were avid readers. Her daddy would bring home books that got sent to the newspaper so he could write reviews, and Sandra read every one of those books. But she credits her mother's storytelling ability with the development of her imagination imagination. Her mother read her and her 4 younger sisters fairy tales. In Sandra's words, she said, she was the one who would say, Jane Eyre is so wonderful. Sandra's imagination has made her a millionaire many times over. At age 75, she still writes a bestseller every year and has more than 80 million books in print in 34 languages. Can you believe that? And in a real aha moment with Sandra Brown, she told us about an imaginary friend named Charlotte that she had when she was so little she doesn't even remember this. But her mother told her that Charlotte had to go with him everywhere. So as an adult, she realized she had been making up people in her mind before she even could remember making up people in her mind. And if that's not a foreshadowing about where her life was going to go, I don't know what is. And also, if you ever have a doubt about the importance of childhood to who you grew up to be, just think about Sandra Brown. This is interesting. So the reason Sandra Brown's even in our book is that another Fort Worth writer recommended her. It was Dan Jenkins, who I know you all know and love here. Dan Jenkins got us to Sandra Brown. So here's Dan Jenkins. I'm telling y'all what you know already. He's one of the greatest and funniest writers of all time. He was born in 1928 in Fort Worth. We interviewed him at his wife's restaurant, Juanita's, in New York City on my birthday. In 1981, he was one of the early adopters. He's most famous for novels like Semi-Tough, which was about football, of course, and then it went on to be a movie. But he wrote for Sports Illustrated and Golf Digest. He loved golf. Dan's mom was sort of like an Annie Mae character. She owned an antique shop, wasn't around that much. His father was charming, a traveling salesman who played golf every day and actually married about 8 times. And so they divorced about 30 minutes after Dan was born, and he was pretty much out of his life. But he went to live with his grandparents, and he told us, "My parents could have lived in a palace somewhere, and you couldn't have gotten me away from my grandmother's." And even though he only saw his parents off and on, there were so many relatives living in the area there. They were coming through Grandma's house all the time. He brought over the football boys. Grandma didn't care how many of them there were. She fed them all. It was a safe place for them to be. And Grandma did that on purpose, he figured out later on, so she would know where he was and that he was safe. He rode his bicycle everywhere. His aunt owned a soda fountain, and he would hang out at the soda fountain. Did any of y'all ever go to those? Well, Dan Jenkins sure did. He thought Fort Worth was the sports capital of the world. With TCU winning national championships and the great golfers Ben Hogan and Byron Nelson being from here, they were his heroes. And Dan is the reason we got another golf grade in the book, and that is Ben Crenshaw from Austin. He said, "You got to have Ben Crenshaw in the book." And when we wrote and said, "Dan Jenkins wants you in the book he's in," Dan said yes. He did. Dan loved sports so much, he would grab the daily newspaper off the front yard before his grandparents could go out there and get it, and he would cut out the sports stories and stick them into a scrapbook. Girls used to do that. This was what Dan Jenkins was so into it, and then he would rewrite those stories because he thought he could do it better. And you know, maybe he did. And his childhood certainly gave him a head start in his career. So we are so proud of this. You know, the 2 biggest Peter Pans ever were, they are both famous native Texans, Mary Martin and Sandy Duncan. Marianne interviewed them both. She met Mary Martin in 1983 in the mansion in Dallas. Y'all know what that is? I have no idea. That's where she met her. She was born in 1913 in Weatherford. Mary was taking violin lessons by age 5, but she played violin by ear. She taught herself dancing, and she loved performing. And it never occurred to her to be anything but an entertainer. The earliest performance she remembers was at the local firehouse when she was 5. She was sort of the mascot of the firemen there. They let her slide down the fire pole. She said that was the biggest thrill of her entire childhood and probably her whole life. So in Peter Pan on Broadway, and Peter had to get into Never Never Land, they built her a fire pole. And she went straight down the pole and didn't even have to practice because it was just a natural from her childhood. She joined the Episcopal Church at age 12, and she heard the minister say that talent was given by God, and it could be taken away just as easy if you didn't take care of it. And that one lesson from her childhood influenced her whole life. She was very strict with her work ethic. Her dedication to performing is legendary. Throughout her long career, she sacrificed much in her personal life, and she told us all about that because she was afraid God was going to take away her talent. She said, "That's why my life has been so strict." All right, so everybody's in this room, their favorite Miss America is who? Phyllis George, of course. She won the crown in 1971 and was the 50th Miss America. She attended TCU right here after she won the Miss Texas. We interviewed her by phone because that was all she had agreed to. We learned later she had health problems. She didn't let on about that. We had our suitcases packed to go to Kentucky, but we weren't going. It is ironic that the day we interviewed her, our husbands will recall this, one of the most beautiful Miss Americas ever, Marianne and I had on no makeup. That's how we looked. One on the other end of the phone was a Miss America. She was born in 1948 in Denton. Growing up in a relatively small town, she said, with loving, supportive parents, gave her a solid foundation. But the most pivotal lesson she learned as a kid came from her piano teacher, who was a world-renowned pianist who taught at the University of North Texas. Turns out, Phyllis was a child prodigy. And her teacher has an unpronounceable name. Her name was Dr. Isabel Sconte. Dr. Isabel Sconte pushed and pushed and pushed her to excel. The biggest lesson Phyllis learned from Dr. Sconte was actually not playing the piano. It was always working to do better. During lessons, Dr. Sconte would say, "Let's do it again. Let's try it one more time. You can always do better." Phyllis said that was a good lesson to learn early in life. And that lesson applied to more than being Miss America. She broke the glass ceiling in sports, women covering TV sports. She was the first female host of a national pregame show in 1975, and later she co-anchored 3 different Super Bowls. Now, today we have all these women. It started with our Miss America. We caught up with former Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison at her home in Dallas before she returned to Brussels for her job she had then as the U.S. ambassador to NATO. Did y'all know Kay Bailey did that? Yeah, she was big at NATO. She was born in 1943 in Galveston, but she grew up in Lamarck. Her family roots go back to the Republic of Texas. She's a DRT member. She has written several books on Texas history. She spent much of her childhood reading every biography that she could get her hands on. And looking back, she thinks that's what gave her the ambition to do everything she's done. She read biographies of real people. So she told us, this is a quote, "I did see so much about great people, and I think it gave me a spark, even though I never gave it a thought of actually doing anything at the time she was reading." You probably know she was a cheerleader at UT, but you may not know what her first job was out of law school. She became the first female reporter actually out covering news on television in Houston. Law firms at that time were not wanting to hire women to be lawyers, and she needed a job. And so she drove by a TV station in Houston one day and said, "What the heck, I'll go in there and ask for a job." And the hiring editor said, "Wouldn't be a bad idea to have a lawyer as a reporter," and that's how she got her job. Would she have done all of that, we wonder, if she hadn't read all those biographies of great people as a kid? So we're guessing that many of you, like Marianne and me and John and Marvin, we just love Delbert McClinton. Y'all know Delbert, bluesman Delbert. He was born in 1940 in Lubbock, but the family moved to Fort Worth later. We have adored his blues music for many, many years, but we honestly didn't realize what a poet he really is and what a deep thinker until we sat with him in Austin. And actually, you might get the premise of what our book could be in several different ways, but Delbert sums it up with a very brief sentence. It's deep. Think of this. He told us succinctly, you are what you hear. That is very impactful. What you hear around the table, what you hear at school, what you hear at church, who your friends are, what you're talking about, that molds you into the thinking that you carry with for your lifetime. So he believes that the sounds of his childhood turned him into the musician he is. He talks about listening every night to the kabang of the rail cars going over the hump in Fort Worth switchyard to connect with the train. He said there was a rhythm to that. He says there's a rhythm and a song in his brain constantly. And as a kid, he remembers playing with other kids outside the Cotton Club up here somewhere, where his parents were inside dancing to Bob Wills. I quote him, "We were running wild through the parking lot listening to Bob Wills. He is still the king." And he recalled hearing the best music in the world on the radio in Fort Worth. He said, "The mix of music that I heard in Texas made me sound like I sound." And he is a 4 or 5 time Grammy award-winning blues man. We think all of that is powerful. And you can't fully appreciate Delbert's music unless you actually know these stories from his childhood. So you all know about Bob Schieffer and the College of Communication up here at TCU, appropriately named for him in 2013. He graduated from TCU in 1959 with a degree in English and journalism. And his long and exceptional career began even before that. Bob Schieffer was born in Austin, and his family moved a lot, but they eventually settled in Fort Worth. He said the family values in the Schieffer household were very simple and enforced by his mother. There was no excuse, he said, for not doing your best. No excuse. You got no credit, this is a quote, you got no credit from her for doing what you were expected to do in the first place. His first grade teacher pegged him as a future reporter, and he loved to write stories. But it was actually playing baseball up here that gave him a photographic memory that came handy in television news. He remembered hits and home runs in such detail that he would lie in bed at night and replay them over and over. And he took that mental discipline with him to the CBS News network. This is a quote. "When I used to do the CBS 11 o'clock news in New York on Sunday nights, I would get so enthusiastic that after it was over, I would go to the hotel and discovered I had memorized the entire newscast, not only the words, but the graphics as well." So next we have Mary Kay. Who here has worn Mary Kay makeup? All right. And I bet any of you fellas wear a Mary Kay baby. I bet all of you recognize the brand Mary Kay had with those pink cars driving around. The founder credits her mother with instilling her a can-do attitude. That's actually the title of her chapter, Can-Do Attitude. She was born in 1918 in Hot Wells near Houston. Her father contracted tuberculosis when Mary Kay was 2, so her mother had to go to work to earn money for the family. Her mother left the house at 5 in the morning and got home at 9 at night. So after school, little Mary Kay cleaned up the house and cooked dinner for her daddy. And she lovingly recalled, this is a quote, "Mama couldn't be there to show me how to do things. So when I needed help, which was frequently during the day, I would call and say, "Mother, Daddy wants potato soup for supper. What do I do?" And her mother would tell her how to do everything. And she always finished with, "You can do it, honey. You can do it." And that was the way her mother had of boosting the kids' confidence. This little girl was all alone, and all her mother could say was, "You can do it." And she did it. It worked. The confidence and work ethic instilled in her by her mother as a little girl helped Mary Kay start a cosmetic business in 1963 that still nets $4 billion a year. And who sells that lipstick and face cream? A self-employed sales force inspired by the company's philosophy that came from Mary Kay's childhood. You can do it. See what I'm saying with this foreshadowing? Okay. Joe Armstrong was born in 1943 in Fort Worth. Joe Armstrong, are you here? Joe got invited, and we were hoping he would walk in on this. Okay. He was born in Fort Worth, but his family moved frequently, and he lived some in Abilene, San Angelo, and all over Dallas. Here he is with his pal, Phyllis George. Joe actually was the connection to us to get to Phyllis. You might not know Joe's name, but he is a publishing genius. As a young man, he turned Rolling Stone magazine, which I know all you old rockers know about, from a struggling music tabloid into the voice of a generation. He went on to publish other magazines such as New York and New West. He had lunch once a week, every week for years with Jacqueline Onassis. So he knew and still knows everybody who was anybody in New York City. And many other New Yorkers have said Joe Armstrong is a standout in this whole city. Everybody here loves Joe Armstrong. He took his Texas pride with him to New York, where he flew a Texas flag outside his window of his office, and that's where we interviewed him. So to understand, now y'all have to keep up with me here. I got to read this fast. To understand how this brash, boot-wearing young Texan took New York media by storm, you'd have to look at his childhood. His parents allowed him a lot of freedom and independence. Quoting Joe, "They encouraged me to do my thing." You know, we used to say that, my thing. My parents would either expose me to opportunities or allow me to find my own. His father was in the trucking business, and there was a damaged freight store where Joe, at age 5 or 6, would go and buy junky stuff, utensils and makeup and whatever, cheap, and sell them door to door. He shelled and sold pecans, Christmas cards, pot holders that he did on those little frames, and magazines. He started Joe's Party and Gift Shop in his house to sell trinkets. And he gave birthday parties for the kids in the neighborhood. The mama would call up and say, "Little Mary Sue's going to have her birthday. Can Joe come over and give her a party?" And Joe would take his trinkets and all of the stuff, and they would have a party. And when he got older, he spent one summer repairing houses in the slums of Milwaukee. He said he never had one burning ambition. But he did say, "It has always been the sense of accomplishment that was important. My parents always taught me that being fulfilled is what it's all about." And he continues to find fulfillment in helping others, including Marianne and me. He is our greatest cheerleader. He calls us, ain't he cute? He calls us the Thelma and Louise of Texas letters. So keep in mind that oral histories, I'm about to get to the end here, are the recollections of the interviewees as they remember them. They may conflict with other accounts that you may dig up, and that's okay. For older interviewees, the true value of the oral history is simply the topics they remember, because these made the lasting impact on their lives. Also, they are looking at their past from the wisdom of age, which they may remember it a little differently than they did when they were 30. And they may unravel or change some family tales with the wisdom of age. For example, country singer Jimmy Dean's father just walked out on the family when Jimmy was 11. And Jimmy was understandably bitter about it throughout his life. We interviewed him at his sausage headquarters in Dallas. Jimmy Dean was born in Olton in 1928 and grew up very poor. He was determined to make something of himself, to show up the schoolyard bullies. He made fun of him because sometimes he didn't have shoes, and he wore overalls and shirts made from sugar sacks. He greatly resented his daddy, deserting the family and making life such a struggle for them. However, as a very accomplished adult at 53 when we interviewed him, he had come to realize that as much as he loved his mother, his parents' split wasn't all his daddy's fault. And Jimmy Dean had learned to appreciate that his own natural talent for entertaining and being friendly and happy in, the Texas way came from both his parents. His mother taught him how to play the piano, but much of his down-home, good old boy public persona was inherited from his personable daddy. We don't know if he actually forgave his father. He didn't really tell us that in the interview. But he certainly had worked through some of the bitterness about it all, or he wouldn't have given him any credit whatsoever. And that's a very good example of how the kinds of intimate, very human stories that come from oral history that you don't get really in any other way. And you won't find those stories unless you look for them. So, to recap and end up here, this project has convinced us that understanding the child is the key to understanding the adult. We think it applies to everybody, not just the bigger-than-life people who are in our book. So looking back at childhoods should be an important part of any biographical research you all do, whether it's for your family, for a project, for a school, for whatever you're doing. Don't forget the childhoods. So, Marianne and I thank you again for having us here with you today. We're happy to answer any questions that you might have. Does anybody have a question? Or have I answered everything?
I just remember Sandra Brown when she was on, I think it was Channel 5?
8.
8?
Yeah.
Yeah, 8. And there was another good-looking young guy out there, and she ended up marrying him.
Yeah.
She was the weather girl.
Was it Weather?
Thanks, man.
Ed Tyler. She was the weather girl of the Tyler
I don't think
TV.
she was Weather in Fort Worth, but she was very personable. I mean, she just shone. So it didn't surprise me that she went on.
And she's beautiful.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Anybody else?
What in your childhood made you what you are?
Well, I'm a journalist, so I'm one of those annoying women with 3 names. So Finkley in the middle is my maiden name. The Finkleys in my family were big storytellers. My daddy could tell a story. He was one of those soldiers who came back from World War II and didn't hold it in, he told it. And his sister could talk about how good her cornbread was, so much that your mouth would water and you just had to go to her house to get some of that cornbread. So they were big-time storytellers, and I was an only child, expected to act like an adult at all times. And so I became a listener early on. I learned that because they were fun to listen to. I learned stuff, I remember stuff, and I've used it my whole career.
So, just real quickly for our Zoomers, where can they get a copy of your book?
Okay, well, Amazon's good. UT Press is good. If you're in Austin, the UT Co-op has it, Book People has it, but Amazon and UT Press. UT Press right now has a 30% off, so if you want to go get one cheaper, that's how you do that. You have a question? My husband has a question.
Yeah, because I think it'll help everybody. What do you do if you're doing an interview and the person starts crying?
Well, you let him cry. And probably you cry a little yourself. So can I tell one more anecdote about Dan Rather?
Of course.
Okay, so we're 31 years old. We're all so young and cute and professional with our little suitcases and recording machines and whatever. And we are in New York City at CBS News. And Walter has retired, and Dan Rather is managing editor, and he's the anchor. And we go into his office, which is tiny. I guess it's New York, it's tiny. And he had on black boots and was so friendly. And we sat down, and he started talking about his daddy, and he got all teared up. And here we are, the professional ladies. What do? Do you get up and hug on Dan Rather and say, it's okay, Dan? Or do you let it pass? And so we just stayed in our seats on his couch, and we let it pass. And we moved on. But he was as tender as Jacqueline Smith. And he said later, when he wrote his own memoir, he hadn't included enough about his daddy. And I think our interview brought that to mind for him, because he's telling stories he should have put in his own book. That's my point we made. Dan Rather got that point, and he cried about it.
I think we have,
Yeah, actually, I have a couple questions. One, when are you writing the next 40 years? You've got lots of stuff that you can write about. You're doing it really good. I haven't read it yet, but just the stories are awesome. And also, are you aware that Oral History Day is kind of the Friday after Thanksgiving, and they encourage people to get together, because families are usually together at Thanksgiving, to record afterwards, and I think we need to share that information more often. And the Library of Congress will actually take recorded stories of people telling their own story.
You need to tell everybody you know about that,
That's awesome.
because that's the way to do it.
And this is great. I appreciate this.
And I appreciate you for saying that. Did she have a question?
Oh, we've got one.
One more.
We came in a few minutes late, and I'm sorry about that. But did you mention Amon Carter?
No. We didn't interview Amon Carter. When did he die?
57. Carter was the mayor of
Fort Worth.
and he was instrumental in creating Dallas Love Field.
Oh, he would have been a good interview. But maybe he was dead already by the time we started in 81. Yeah. We missed a lot of people, you know. I really, really, really wanted Sandra. What? Sandra Day O'Connor, the very first woman on the Supreme Court. She went to school in El Paso and was born there, but she lived the rest of the time in Arizona, I think. But she wrote about Arizona all the time, but she never wrote about Texas. And we really wanted that. But by the time we got to her, she had dementia. And she would have liked to have done it, her staff said, but they wouldn't allow her to. Another point, do it now, don't wait 40 years. Willie, Willie is elusive. You wouldn't think so, but Willie has written multiple times about his own childhood. So Marianne and I came up with, oh, you want to tell about Earl? Okay, you can tell about.
I'm not going to tell about Earl.
Yeah, but hold on, let me finish about Willie. Marianne and I decided his sister, Bobby, would be a better story, because she raised Willie, you know. And she said yes. And then she said no. She was one of those we chased for a very long time. And at the end, she said, you know, nobody really cares about me. All they care about is Willie. She's wrong about that. And then within the year, she and Willie had written a book about their childhoods. Have y'all read that? It's a sweet little paperback book. Very soon.
No, I wasn't going to tell about Earl, but my nephew is here, and he is a journalism graduate from the University of Texas and lives on Wabash, or whatever, right here by the university. So I have to take he and his wife and little boy to lunch because the little boy has a game. But no, we did try to get Earl Campbell, and it was I was so persistent because I kept telling him it was about him to tell about his mother, who he always talked about with the Rose Gardens. But the coach, Kenneth Dabbs, who had recruited him to UT, he and I both worked forever, and your dad Earl was raised in Tyler. So
Where Marianne's from. Marianne said, I can't go home and not have Earl in the
people didn't
book.
want to know why Earl Campbell's not in it. But Earl wanted to get paid for it. And my husband was a coach and athletic director at Austin Westlake. And when my husband retired, the only thing Earl was worried about was that would somebody else give him the handicap sticker to go to the ball games, you know. So I am going to give Earl Campbell one of these books, so let him know. Because one of his sons said I was just so aggressive in trying to get him to do this book, but and especially after UT did the publishing of it. It didn't make any sense. But you had Jerry Leviathan, and that was probably better than Earl Campbell ever would have been. So,
We could have done with both.
but these two women are just incredible. And of course, I've known Gaylon forever, and she is just full of good stories. So I hate to have to leave.
You have to run off, and so does everybody else.
But-
So, thank you.